Let her rip.
Okay. Let me begin by asking a question. It's going to take maybe a few minutes here. How many of you use the King James Version of the Bible? Would you raise your hand? Okay. How many use, and this is going to be funny, I think, how many of you use the American Standard Version? Now, I have to raise my hand. Oh, more than I... Can you tell me where to get a new preaching copy? I've been trying... Huh? All right, how many, I'm going to try a few more here. How many of you use the Revised Standard Version? Anybody use the Revised Standard Version? There's 1, 2 there. All right, how many use the New International Version? The New International Version. 1, 2, 3 there. 4, okay. Okay, now let me ask you another question. The other one I'll just ask, who used the version I didn't mention? How many? Okay, what? Go ahead and mention these.
New American Standard.
Oh, New American, yeah, the NASB, that's right. Okay.
New Revised Standard.
The New Revised Standard, all right. Anybody else?
What about the New King James?
All right, the New King James Version. Good. Anybody else before I go on? All right, well, I know you're well aware of the fact that we're living in a time when there has been a proliferation of translations. And matter of fact, one of the sources I had here, I don't know if I have time to mention too many books later, but a very excellent work to introduce you to most of the versions and help you to decide yourself how you might choose. It's called So Many Versions. This is the second edition of it by Kubo and Sprecht. They have a listing from 1900 through 1982 of attempts to translate the Bible in whole or part since that time, from 1900 to 1982, and there are 159 listed. 47 of them are New Testaments only, and 32 are complete Bibles. That many translated since 1900 up through 1982, and that doesn't include, of course, it does include the New King James Version, but it also includes it doesn't include such things as the Revised English Bible and the New Revised Standard Version and some others. Now, some of these are just translations of the Gospels, some of the Psalms or the Epistles of Paul included in that 149. But that's a remarkable number. Yes, English versions. That's what I'm talking about. So I guess it would be nice if I'd mentioned that, wouldn't it? These are all English versions, modern English versions, we'll call them, since about 1900. And I'm sure that probably none of you, since I've got an idea already what you use, other than the King James and the American Standard Version, probably none of you use any of the other attempts. And of course, they go back earlier than 1900. The translation of the Bible into some kind of English, Anglo-Saxon began, of course, back around 700-800 A.D., just portions, sometimes interlinear of Latin text, and otherwise the translation into English has been going on a long time, ever since the Middle Ages. Of course, the Bible wasn't written in English for a very good reason. It didn't exist at that time. The Old Testament, was written in Hebrew, primarily Hebrew, some portions Aramaic, but they're very close. Then the New Testament in Greek, and Koine Greek is the proper term to describe basically the kind of Greek the New Testament was written in. Well, how are we going to understand our Bible? We depend on English translations. And with the proliferation of translations in our day especially, how are we going to know what the truth is? Or is it a matter of that? I remember in a ladies' Bible class I teach one time, we were going along in the text. I use the American Standard Version myself, as I pointed out to you. Half my memorization's in the King James, and the other half is in the American Standard Version. But anyway, I was going along in the class, and some lady raised her hand and said, well, that's not what my version says, And I said, well, what does it say, And we discussed it and found out that in a class of about 15 ladies, there were 6 different versions. Modern English versions. That is version. Most of them had the King James, but about half of them had some other versions, including the NIV and the New American Standard and so forth. But anyway, it caused a little bit of problem in the wording, And it gets a little frustrating. When I started preaching years ago, I didn't have much of a problem that way. I'd preach and I'd teach in the class, and the American Standard is so close to the King James Version that we had no problem, But boy, it's changed over the years. Now that we have so many different translations among us, the wording sometimes causes a problem with the difference in the wording. And so there certainly is a problem there. I know a lot of people are confused. I believe most of an older generation probably were born and bred on the King James Version. And probably, at least to a large extent, the outdatedness of a lot of the English expressions and everything they've grown up with. So to them, they're no problem. And yet for younger generations, they have a real problem. I have also a chart that indicates that, let me give you a little insight into this. I have a number of translations with me. One of the newer ones, some of our brethren had something to do with this one. This has an interesting history. It's called the I'll call it Holy Bible, all right, but it's the International Children's Bible translation. It's actually the Century version that is related to the one for the deaf, that was produced and so forth and so on. This all comes out of it. They're basically the same text. But anyway, this reads on a 3rd grade level. And that's interesting. The King James is on a 14th grade level. Now, when I saw that on the chart, I figured, well, I know what the 12th grade is. The 14th must be the 2nd year in college. That's the only thing I could figure, and I guess that's what they meant. But what is the reason for that? Well, most of them think that you have to be in college before you can understand Shakespeare. And, of course, there's a relationship between, in fact, the English is basically Shakespearean English for all practical purposes. And so the young people, of course, are looking for something that they can understand. They don't know a lot of what to them is quaint language and so forth. But now, I thought the best thing I could do is to give some guidelines, and that's really what I'm going to have to do in here. Let me point out ahead of time, I am not going to take the position in the class that you should use either the King James or the American Standard Version. I'm not going to take that position. What position I'm going to take, I think, will come out in what I have to say. I use the American Standard. I said I have the King James Version in memory for a large extent, and due to that fact, that's what I'm going to be using, I'm sure, the rest of my life. For one thing, you can't teach an old dog new tricks if you tried to, probably, in that matter. But I do need to find out from somebody here before we're done where I can buy another one of these, that's in better shape than this one is, this American Standard. Those of you that use that. That's what we began to use back in school years ago. But how is a person who is confused, who wasn't born and bred on the King James, and they find it very difficult to understand it, or the American Standard that I use? What can you give them in guidelines? Of course, it could turn out that we should stay with one of those two and teach the young people that, no matter how difficult it is to understand it. Theoretically, that could be the answer after we give the guidelines. But we'll see. To start with, first of all, I have 4 considerations that are important here, and the last one's going to be a little bit more difficult to convey, but I think the earlier ones are going to be easy enough, and I do hope to give you a chance for some questions as you have the opportunity. First of all, when people are looking for a translation, many of them are looking for simplicity. And that seems to be the thing, especially, I say, when they find the difficulty with the King James English. I'm talking about young people, now, that weren't born and bred on it and didn't cut their teeth on it and don't have a hard time being edified in reading it. It's a fact that's with us. I have that complaint all the time that comes to my attention as a preacher, and I'm sure other preachers do too. But anyway, simplicity. Well, of course, that children's Bible, which is a good translation, what I've been able to look over it, it is more on the literal side, but we got to understand what we mean by literal. Closer to the structure of the original language is what we usually mean by the word literal. But you got to watch literal because to take a word like trunk, it's hard to take that word literally, isn't it? Because it describes the front end of an elephant and the back end of a car, the bottom of a tree, the middle of a person's body, and the entirety of a large piece of luggage. And if you add S to it, you know what that is. Trunks. Refer to pants, that you wear. All right. So there is nothing literal except in a specific context. You have to be in a specific context to get to see something literal. But usually we mean it's closer to the, and I hate to use words like this if you're not familiar with them, but to the structure, the syntax, and everything of the original language. They put the English just as close as they can to it. And that's true of the King James Version, it's true of the American Standard Version, and it's true of this children's version, really, although it's simpler, much simpler. They use just a modicum of words. I think somewhere around 850, something like that, I believe, I may not be right on that because I know it's related to the Simple English Bible, which I think uses 3,000, and I think they're related to the basic text. But anyway, maybe 3,000 words. But anyway, they're very simple. The sentences are short, and it's easy to understand for a child. And we haven't had many for children down through the age. What they used to do is just take the King James Version and put children's pictures in them, and make that a child's version, but the children couldn't understand it too well. And then they got to where they simplified it by taking out some of the harder parts, but then you didn't have the whole Bible. And then they tried to remake it just by the change in the wording. But this is a completely new translation and seems to do real well. And there's everything in between, a third grade level up to the 14th grade that I mentioned. And I think the NIV is about the 7th grade level. And in any case, simplicity is something that people are looking for when they are trying to something they can understand. Otherwise, I read this and understand what it says right away. It's just that clear. That's what a lot of people are looking for. Now, the second thing I would mention is readability, which is not necessarily the same thing as simplicity. Readability means I'm thinking more about how it flows along. And it's smooth. You feel like you're just going from one verse to another, and you're just moving right on through, you see. Some think when they talk about readability of the quality and the beauty of the language. Well, of course, the King James Version has been known for its beauty and the quality of English, although some would say today that the quality suffered some because it was attempted to be pretty close to the Greek and the Hebrew, rather than just kind of taken off, and being free with the English in translation. And we'll talk more about that difference later on. That'll be the fourth point that I have to get across to you. But I still like, the King James Version in passages like 1 Corinthians, when Paul makes the statement that after he's preached to others, he himself should be a castaway. Beautiful way of rendering it. Not a reject, not lost to, which of course is what it means. But the beauty of it is good. And so Paul, after he's preached to others, that's why he buffets his own body and brings it into bondage, lest he become a castaway. It's just there's a beauty there. Of course, there are many passages where that's true. Well, some people are looking for that. Now, these are in a way are minor things to look for in a way, because the third thing we're going to come to probably takes precedence over the others, and that's accuracy. No matter how smooth the Bible may read, an English version of it, no matter how simple it might be, if it's not accurate, then of course we've got a problem. Now, this may surprise you when I make this statement, but I believe it's true. Over the years that I've looked at translations and studied them, I don't mean to say that I have mastered all the translations out. I don't know who can do that. Jack P. Lewis has probably come as close as anybody in the sense that the book he's put out is one of the most thorough evaluations of the major versions to come out. But let me just make the statement. I think most of the English translations on the market today, and I mean across the board, are good, pretty good. And what I mean by that is you're not going to read them and go to hell as a result of it, getting all mixed up on doctrine and everything else. Now, almost all of them, in fact, I would say all of them have some doctrinal problems that you have to look out for. There's no question about it. The NIV, for example, in Psalm 51, says that I was born in sin. I was born a sinner, which is not what the Hebrew says, but reflects the doctrine or belief in original sin. You got to watch that. But there are a lot of other places that read real well. There are in almost any translation. One that I would say, that I wouldn't say that about would be like the New World Translation of the Greek or of the Holy Scriptures when you put the Old and New Testament together, the Jehovah's Witnesses, because they doctrine up first of all to deny the divinity of Christ and also to push some of their other doctrinal stances. Well, that's not reliable, and you're always going to get some doctrinal bias in almost any translation. This is a fact. You just cannot. Again, as much as I think of the King James Version, Calvinistic flavoring is all the way through there. You see it in certain passages like Romans 8. You can't miss it. And of course, the biggest thing that's been pointed out about it is in chapter. I'm sure that if you use the King James Version, you've seen Acts chapter 12 and verse 4, which uses Easter. Well, Easter didn't exist back then. All the other translations there say Passover. So you've got to watch some things in all of them. But that doesn't mean they're all equal. Some are better than others. Some are you'll feel more comfortable with. Accuracy is a very important thing. It means being, first of all, faithful to the original text. And what I mean by that is that if a translator is translating the New Testament from the Greek, he has to be faithful to what that Greek says. And this is where the problem comes in about "Thus saith the Lord." You can't quote the Bible, the New Testament, any part of it, on the problem of translations because of the very nature of the situation. The Bible's what's in question here. Translation is going to have to be a combination of our judgment, our good judgment, and belief in God's providence in making sure that His Word is faithfully translated into English by the ones that do it. That's what it amounts to. The original manuscripts, what we, of course, refer to as the autographs. For example, take Romans. Romans, as Paul wrote it originally in Greek, was inspired, letter perfect. And that's what is really infallible. No English translation is itself infallible because of the nature of the thing in translation. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be misled and you won't know God's will. I have perfect confidence in the fact that the New Testament that I use, the American Standard, for example, reflects accurately the will of God. Now, of course, I've had training in Greek too, and I can read the Greek New Testament and check up on it, but probably most of you can't. And in a way, you're going to have to trust what others say about translation and what's good or not good in translation. Incidentally, while I'm on that point, just for a minute about it, let me mention this book again by so many versions by Kubo and Specht, S-P-E-C-H-T. Kubo is just simply K-U-B-O, as a good work. Well, I don't think I'll show you that one so much. As the one I mentioned by Jack P. Lewis who's now retired from the graduate department of Harding, has written one called The English Bible from the King James to the NIV, A History of Evaluation. This is an interesting book. As a matter of fact, this is due to be come out in the January of this year with a new edition. And I noticed this one, it says it's 500 and some pages. This one's 407. So apparently he's made it a little bit thicker than this. It's the most thorough you can get. Now, it doesn't mean I agree with all his judgments, because I don't. And that's what we're talking about, though, are judgments. You know, whether this is good or not good in translation. And yet it's very interesting. Now I have to admit something here. I'm gonna tip you off on something. I probably shouldn't take the time to do it, but I'm gonna do it anyway because in a way I get a little kick out of it because of the rivalry. Some of you are familiar with the work by Foy E. Wallace Jr. called A Review of Modern Versions, a book thicker than this. I think it's thicker than the new edition of this. Now, there are a lot of very good things in there. It's really, I'll tell you one thing I always said about Foy E. Wallace Jr., and that is he's an independent thinker. And if he writes on a subject, you better read it, because you'll be missing something on that subject if you don't, because he'll have a point of view and bring out some things you hadn't thought about. But anyway, he defends the King James Version of the Bible and also the American Standards kind of secondarily as being really the safe translations. Now I don't have to agree with that conclusion, but what's so interesting about it is Jack P. Lewis decided to write. I really believe that this was written in response to Foy Wallace's book. The reason is because as I look at all the chapters here, I see a chapter on the American Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version, the Jerusalem Bible, the New American Standard, all of those just titled that way. But when it comes to the King James Version, he entitles it not the King James Version, but Doctrinal Problems in the King James Version, which I think he's tipped his head there. There must be a prejudice there. But anyway, that goes on. I mean, there are different viewpoints along that. But anyway, the book is very well worth reading, though, among others. And the thing, though, this book, it will inform you about what the different versions say. A book like this helps you to decide yourself what you need to think about in picking a version of Scriptures, if you haven't already done it. That you use. Ordinarily, we do that. We have a Bible we use. Now, on my desk, like a lot of preachers, I have probably 10, 12 different translations. But I use the American Standard in the pulpit in my teaching. That's my basic study Bible and the one I use. And that may be true with you too, even if you're not a preacher. You know, you may have several versions you use, yet there's one you bring to Bible class and maybe one you take in the auditorium to check up on the preacher when he's preaching. But anyway, these books are designed to help us to do it. Now, if you want to get background on a lot of things that I simply cannot go into, this is a good book by Kohlenberger. He's John R. Kohlenberger III. He did a complete interlinear of the Old Testament in Hebrew, putting English under all of it. He did that whole thing. But it's called Words About the Word, a guide to choosing and using your Bible. And this has a lot of information on it. Some of it is technical, and which may not, help me of any. It may not edify you too much, and so you can just look over that. But there are also some very good things that he does. He's conservative and yet has a very good knowledge of the biblical languages and very familiar with the modern English translations. So that's all I have time, though. Kohlenberger's Kohlenberger. It's called Words About the Word. This is 1987. It's one of the most recent publications. Incidentally, he has some charts that are very important. You might be right now, while we're still talking about accuracy, let me give you this information, though, to think about when we talk about accuracy. Right now, as far as I know, this hasn't changed too much, although it's only up to about 1987. Would you guess for a moment what you think is the English Bible that is the bestseller now? All right, that's correct. It is the NIV. The King James, which for years, of course, centuries, almost a couple centuries, has been the bestseller, has finally come down into second place. The King James, now that's the effect of all the proliferation of these modern versions. That's what's happened. But the NIV has taken first place. Of course, it had a tremendous advertising campaign behind it, even before it hit the market. Of course, that's how you do it these days. Then what would you think is the third one? No? The Living Bible. And that's not strictly a translation. It's a paraphrase. Incidentally, if you want to know what a paraphrase is, I tried to think of simple ways to get an idea across without telling you what a translation is right now, because I have to do that later in two parts. Let me tell you what a paraphrase is. A paraphrase can be thought of this way, where someone has said something, and then you come by and say, in other words, this is what, otherwise you're putting in other words. And it doesn't mean that you're being faithful to using any of the words he used at all, necessarily, but you're trying to say the same thing. And of course, that's okay. I look at the Living Bible as sort of it can be used more like a commentary, because it can be frustrating. In fact, right now I'm in a series of, I'm teaching a cottage meeting class, whatever you want to call it, around a kitchen table on Thursday nights. And the young lady we're trying to convert uses the Living Bible. And you can't imagine the frustration in trying to get to accuracy, to the text, because it's just in other words. And sometimes the very word you need in order to persuade her is not there, see. In the Living Bible, there's problems. Yet people find it very easy, very simple, very readable. Well, it is. It's all those things. It's simple and it's readable. But it's not a translation. And he tells you it's not. Kenneth Taylor, who did it in the preface, tells you it's a paraphrase. And he didn't make, he's given money away, most all the money he's ever made on it. He's not lined his own pockets with the money. And yet, as I say now, it was one time way up there and it's declined. The Living Bible has declined. Now, what do you think is the fourth best-selling? Give you a chance here to contribute a little bit. What would you guess? Huh?
New American.
No, I might have thought that too. Yeah. Pardon?
Today's English version?
No, that has slipped. It used to be a high seller. It's gone way down now. Huh?
New King James.
The New King James Version. That's right. The New King James is the third bestseller. Then comes the New American Standard Bible, which also has declined somewhat from a higher position. The New American Standard comes fourth. And you won't probably guess the fifth one because it's not properly a Protestant Bible. It's called the New American Bible for Catholics. And it's a modern English translation. Strangely enough, it's quite literal. Of course, you still have the footnotes, that tell you what the text means from the Catholic standpoint. The Catholic Church still cannot get away from the idea that the Catholic Church must tell you what you're not really safe by yourself with the Scriptures. They've loosened up on it a great deal, but they still can't get away from it. That ultimately you've got to listen to what the church says as to what it means. All right, now accuracy then is what we're talking about, and that means being first faithful to the Greek in the New Testament. You see, in the Hebrew of the Old Testament. I'll probably mostly use the New Testament example here, but doctrinal purity too is a problem. That has to be looked at, because some doctrine can certainly be affected by the way people translate. Yet, if I were to make a list of all the major doctrines of the New Testament, I could take almost any one of the modern English translations and verify that by those translations. You have to go through the process to believe it, but you can. As I say, some of them have a Calvinistic background to it. Some try to. The NIV is guilty to some extent of translating in such a way to imply the doctrine of faith only. You have to watch that, but at the same time, you can't actually, sometimes the translation go one or both ways. There's an ambiguity there sometimes, and you might, because of what you believe the Bible teaches as a whole, you shouldn't have translated it that way, and that's probably correct. But sometimes we're talking about strict translation. You can't fault them in the sense you can say that is absolutely wrong what you did. You see, you can't. It's not that simple, is what I'm trying to point out. So you've got to look out for that. And of course, in my estimation, that's one of the reasons I use the American Standard. I feel that even though there's some Calvinistic influence in here too, I can show you some passages that I just have to swallow and have all along because they're tinted that way. But on the whole, this tries to keep very close to the original language, you see, as it's structured, without being it's good Greek, but someone said the American Standard is impossible English, good Greek, but impossible English. And sometimes that's true. You have a bunch of fro words and to you word and to us word and all that kind of thing, But in any case, I've always felt, of course, that that this is strong doctrinally and so forth. So you have to watch that. It has to be a consideration. To me, that should be the first thing, because the will of God is, secondarily, simplicity and readability. And yet, of course, the simpler it is, the easier you're going to understand. What I'm trying to say is here, you can have accuracy and you can have doctrinal purity and still have simplicity and readability. It's hard to get the combination, perhaps, but I think it's possible. Now I have to come to a part that is not as easy to understand. Another thing you have to take into consideration, and you may not have any way to know about this except maybe through some of these books I recommended. But, and I'm going to put this on the board because I think it's very important, and I'm talking here about translation theory, because a change has taken place in the theory of translation that affects the English translations as well as in any other language. And let me put it this way by using the terminology. The older method, which we're familiar with, has been called today in the discussions formal equivalence. You may not understand what I'm talking about right now, but you will as we go on. I'm getting wrapped up in this. What I want to point out about this is the fact that this refers to, for example, you might, if you're taking some notes, you might have put down that the King James Version is a translation characterized by formal equivalence, which means that you have a language, which is the Greek, and then the English you're trying to put it into, and you're trying to find an equivalence, a very close equivalence in English for the Greek. And that's called formal equivalence. Well, the American Standard Version is a formal equivalence. So is the New American Standard Bible. So is the Revised Standard Version. It's a formal equivalence translation, basically, even though there's been some doctrinal things pointed out about that. Yet it is basically a formal equivalence translation. When I compare it with the other, you'll see more what I'm talking about here. And then another one, of course, is the New Revised Standard Version, which just came out in 1990. I've been through that and noticed that it's too very, very conservative as far as being close to the Greek and the Hebrew. Incidentally, one of the doctrinal problems of the New Revised Standard Version has been cleared up. In Psalm 45:6, the original Revised Standard Version said, "Your divine throne," taking the word God there, which should read, "Your throne, O God," should read, "O God," because that's quoted in Hebrews and applied to Christ. Well, in the Revised Standard Version, they took the noun and made it into an adjective. Your divine throne. I noticed in the New Revised Standard Version, they've gone back to your throne, O God. They must have got a lot of criticism on that over the years. Now, of course, it came out in 1952. That's the year I graduated from high school, and I remember all the furor and fuss over the RSV. They had young woman in Isaiah 7:14, and instead of virgin, and they had and they were the first translation to in John 3:16 say that use instead of only begotten son to use only son. And yet almost every translation since then uses only son. I haven't got time to go into all those doctrinal points, but anyway, it is basically a formal equivalence. The NIV is sort of a mixture. And a mixture with what? Well, the next one we're going to talk about. The other time is called the dynamic equivalence. And the dynamic is today now more recently called the functional equivalence. They're getting away from the word dynamic. There are several books that, again, I could tell you about, but if anyone's interested in some more about this afterward, I can talk to you about it. But what does this mean? Rather than taking a word or a word or two and in the Greek and putting it into English with the closest equivalent you can find, they take a sentence, maybe even a short paragraph as a whole, and just rework it into understandable English, which is not the same thing, you see, as this formal equivalence business. And actually, the first translation in English to do that is the NEB. That is an official translation to do that, the New English Bible. And that, of course, was done in England, but it's been popular in this country until more recently. And as I say, it's been revised, and the revision's the same way. It's a dynamic equivalence vision. Now, the problem here is this. There has been definitely an influence of existentialism on this point, because this is bound up with the idea that the reader is as important as the writer who wrote the original thing. Like Paul wrote Romans, and if I read it, I am to be taken into consideration as much as Paul, and I am to color the translation as much as he did in writing it. And there, of course, you're going to get into trouble. Now, I'm talking more about the extreme idea of it. Because, in fact, let me put it this way. A translation is usually, a formal equivalence would be something like this. You would read this Greek, see, and you'd say to yourself, now, how can I take this Greek and make a good English out of it, you see, put it into good English? With dynamic or functional equivalence, the answer is this. How would I have put it as an English-speaking person if I had been back there and written Romans? See, how would a good English person have rendered that? Now, there's all the difference in the world when you look at that way. Because what you're doing is you're not looking at the Greek as authoritative and then saying, let's try to put this faithfully into the English as close as we can. But what you're saying is, all right, there's an idea. Now, if I were an Englishman living back there, how would I have put it? And hence even Moffat, not Moffat, but the J. Powers Smith Goodspeed Bible that came out from the University of Chicago. Goodspeed in Acts 8, when it talked about Philip coming up to the chariot, he called it a car. Well, that's dynamic equivalence. See, automobile, car. People wouldn't understand. And well, of course, there are some things that are always a problem trying to get it into English, because you do have idioms in a foreign language, and that's hard to put exactly into English because it doesn't make sense if you do. Because it's like even in English we have our idioms all the time. Like, for example, I say that guy over there, and I'm not really pointing at anybody specifically, has bats in his belfry. Well, someone trying to learn the English language, they know what a bat is. Bats fly. They're learning that. A belfry in the tower. Oh, well, I wonder what he means. He's got bats. How does he have a belfry? And does he own one? And what are bats doing flying? What does it mean? Well, you and I know what it means. It means the guy hasn't got all of his marbles. That's another one. See? And on it goes, right. But it means he ain't quite right, see? Well, all right, that's an idiom. Well, they have them in Greek, they have them in Hebrew, and you can't put them into English literally. You've got every translator, including the King James, the American Standard, have to make some kind of a concession there, you see, and get in a little bit into the dynamic equivalence. That's what I meant when I said the NIV is really kind of a combination. The NIV tries to be very close to the Hebrew and Greek, But once in a while, they're thinking about the one who's reading it. Is he going to understand this? And then they'll do kind of a flip-flop over to the dynamic equivalence and actually leave the Greek or the Hebrew. But anyway, this is popular today. And the translations in the functional equivalents I said are the NEB, the New English Bible, and of course the Revised English Bible is the same way that just came out. The NIV is a mixture, as I already pointed out. The TEV, today's English version, also the whole Bible is called the Good News Bible, and it was done by the American Bible Society translation is really what it is. It's on about a 7th grade level, and it was very popular when it first came out, but it's declined, as I indicated earlier. But it is definitely, because some of them associated with that translation were very much in the forefront of this, of pushing this kind of a thing. So anyway, they're that way. The New Jerusalem Bible. How many of you have heard of the New Jerusalem Bible? It's there was the Jerusalem Bible. Now there's the New Jerusalem Bible, and of course it's dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence. And so is Phillips. How many of you ever used the Phillips New Testament? That's a very much in this line because it attempts. J.B. Phillips, who did that, began to translate it when he was with children in basements during the Second World War when they were being bombed. You know, they're down there in the bomb shelter, and these young children were trying to read the Bible, and he was reading it with them, but the King James Version, and it wasn't edifying them too much because they didn't understand the archaic English and so forth. So he began to make his own translation, and it finally grew. He did the Gospels, I think, then the Book of Acts, and then the Epistles, and finally in 1958 it came out, the J.B. Phillips translation of the New Testament. Very interesting to use and very helpful. He often catches the spirit. But if you're looking for accuracy in the sense of being close to the text and the wording of the Greek and the Hebrew, no. Because he sacrifices that sometimes to try to get the accuracy of meaning or spirit of it more. And in any case, this is what we're up against. Now, you see, these are the things to take into consideration when you, of course, some people even think when they're talking about a Bible, well, does it have good maps? Does it have a center column? Is the print big? Is it bound well? Well, surely those things are secondary compared to probably the most important, which is accuracy, because it's the Word of God. I need to know the Word and need to act on it. I need to know what the thus saith the Lord is if I'm going to be pleasing to God and go to heaven someday. So accuracy has to be important. Now, how much time do I have? Okay, I've got 4 minutes. Okay, let me leave it open for you for questions. Of course, if you're asking me a question, what translation should you use? I can't really tell you what to use. I can only indicate to you what I think that probably the ones you can use, with some probably the ones already mentioned in here for the most part, that you can use probably with a maximum of safety and a minimum of problems. And of course that now again you'd have to. The King James is in a class by itself in the sense that it does not, by modern standards of reading, it's not very readable, and it's not simple in that sense. It's accurate for the most part, but all this, is relative. It's accurate. It's doctrinally pure, and so forth. The same can almost be said about the American Standard of what I'm saying about the King James Version. And so if you don't worry about simplicity and readability, smoothness, and so forth like that, by today's standards, I'm talking about what is smooth to the person who reads today in the modern English. Then, of course, the King James and the American Standard are good translations. Personally, if I were to change, this is all I can tell you. If I were to change, I'd probably go to the New American Standard Bible. The New King James Version is good. It, however, holds to the text of the old King James Version, albeit there are notes explaining that, so that there's no problem. Of course, this can be overplayed, but this is also important. There have been some of the most, of course, tremendous advances in our understanding of the Hebrew and Greek due to not only inscriptional evidence that's been uncovered, but also archaeological findings and so forth. Some of the greatest have been found in this century. And from that standpoint, the one I used was premature because this is 1901 and premature. And it was that very consideration that caused the Revised Standard Version to come out with the new Revised Standard Version. Because since 1946, when the New Testament came out, and 52 when the whole Bible came out, there have been more new advances. They hardly had time to consider the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. Almost every book of the Old Testament, except Esther, has been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, older than anything we've had before. A lot of them are fragmentary, of course, but still, be taken into consideration to get more and more accuracy and exactly understand what the words are. If I had more time, I'd give you some illustrations of how difficult sometimes translation can be, but that's what I would probably change to. Now I'll be quite familiar with it. My wife uses the NIV. She uses it because it's readable, and she feels it's accurate. She knows, of course, Psalm 51 and verse 5 that's not rendered correctly, and a few other places, but that's what she uses. I can't fight with her. She's gonna use it. But that's what I use. All right, now let me open for questions in the next 2 minutes.
How do you explain the Latin Vulgate, which was done into a common language? There was so much criticism that it was not a proper language for the Scriptures, Greek, and became the standard for 1,000 years. And then the English language was thought not to be a proper language for.
That's right.
And the common language, and now then the modern English language is thought not to be by many a language worthy of the translation.
Yes.
Can you explain?
Yes. Well, okay. First of all, the Catholic Church had a lot to do with the keeping it in the Latin, and there's no question that Latin had spread all over the Western world, and all the scriptures were in Latin. All the early translations came out of the Latin instead of the original languages. Like even John Wycliffe, who did the whole Bible in English about 1384 from the Latin. Tyndale was the first man to do the New Testament from the original Greek. All right, now the Catholic Church opposed because of the thing we talked about earlier. They said you've got to have the Catholic Church to interpret the Scriptures. Keep it in Latin, because if you put it in English, it's going to get out of hand. What happened is, finally, the Catholics saw that it was getting out of hand. And so in the 16th century, even before the King James Version, they said, well, since it's gotten out of hand, if it's going to be done, let's do it right. So the Catholic Church put out an English translation called the Douay Rheims Bible. It's still printed today, although there have been other Catholic versions now. But now, I may be seeing two things here talking about. Let me go just a little bit further here. A lot of people don't know that the King James translation had a very difficult time getting accepted. It took us over a century. It was talked against. I'm going to use this. Well, I hope it's all right to use this word. But one of the phrases that came out back there when it was first published is, it called the translators damnable corrupters of God's Word. The ones that did the King James Version. And but after a time, it had to fight against the Geneva Bible, which had come out in 1560, which our Pilgrim Fathers brought over here, the one that Shakespeare quoted from. That was popular. Everybody thought that was the right translation. King James had to fight for 100 years. Once it did, there's never been anything like it. I mean, the King James had more impact than any other single translation in the history of the English translation. But it took time. And people opposed it and everything. Now, there's always that problem when new versions come out. And there's going to be people going to oppose it. Maybe some things ought to be opposed in it. In fact, there were some things brought out in the King James, that technically are very small things in its day. Of course, another thing, if you take the position you've got to use the King James Version, there's another question that comes up: which King James Version? It came out in 1611. A first revision of some of the language was made in 1629. In about 1760, it was modernized for more modern English than it was back there. If you had today a facsimile of the original 1611 King James Version, you'd have an awful hard time reading it. It'd be very difficult. It's been modernized. For modern English, because the language changed. This was supposed to be a revision of it, but it failed for all practical purposes, really, as far as the public is concerned. All right, I'm gonna have to. When you turn it off, maybe we can stay a little bit if anyone.